Okay, now we're getting into some heavy stuff, right, Lori? So the dreaded recalc in rounding. This is probably a lot of the calls we get to support is my rounding doesn't go to enable. It's stuck in recalculate. Why? Okay. So recalculate or rounding is one of the last things you put on a file. And rounding catches a lot of things that are going on. Okay. So when you hit recalc in rounding, take a look at these items in particular. So the number one reason, I'll let you guess from this slide. I'm going to tell you in a moment here, but let's go through what each of these are, okay? So selecting a rounding account that's been manually overridden, or somebody has gone in the cell and changed a property like a flip sign. The second one, enabling rounding when making additional changes. So we turned on rounding and then we back to case where I made some more journal entries. That's not going to work. Third one, selecting a rounding account which appears in more than one place. I'll tell you it's not that one. That doesn't happen very often. So that would be, for some reason, we have two accounts payable in our balance sheet and we chose accounts payable for rounding. The last one, opening retained earnings balance does not agree to the prior year's closing. Okay. Now you think about that. I wish I could ask a poll question right here in terms of what you think it all is. I know which one I thought it was originally, and it actually wasn't because I went back and looked at the support cases. Lori, I think, any ideas? Which one did you originally think it was?
I originally picked that the opening retained earnings this year did not equal the closing last year because I know how many cases I've taken. However, I find that over probably the last year or so, it's actually item 1 where I've found that there's a lot of people that are manually overriding or taking out formulas, and now the mechanics to be able to round to that line have been broken, so it doesn't work.
So there it is. Okay, so absolutely, you're right. That selecting a rounding account which has been manually overridden, including changing any of the cell properties. So maybe we just deleted the calculation, threw a number in there, or we made it a flip account because we didn't like the sign on it. All of that stuff is evil and it will break the rounding. It will not work. Now, I don't recommend doing that at all because when you roll the file forward, it's going to give you problems. It's much better to actually disable a calculated line using 999, inserting a manual line and typing in your description and balances rather than editing a calculated one. The reason being, a manual line will actually move the balance to prior year automatically when you roll forward, and it'll leave you an open empty cell in the current year, whereas this hack will be stuck in there for next year. So really avoid doing this, okay? This probably is the most common. And so what I've done here is I chose accounts payable in my balance sheet. I've overridden the cell. I turned on rounding and it goes straight to recalculate. Can't add or subtract the rounding difference because the calculation has been changed on that cell. Bad. Okay, next one. Rounding, enabling a rounding and more changes are done. So, Lori, how does this happen? Can you tell me how this happens?
I mean, if it was me, I think that as soon as I get the income statement and the balance sheet done, I'm typically a lot of the way through my file, and if I've got it so that it's, within a buck or two, I'm excited to turn on the rounding because there's a certain satisfaction with knowing that you're done to that point. Unfortunately, that means that the cash flow isn't done if it's in there, and that creates a problem because everything's been rounded to accounts payable, and usually there's a big number in the cash flow because it hasn't been dealt with yet.
Exactly, and that is the question that we get. Somebody calls up and says, why is there a weird number in my accounts payable in the cash flow? And most of the time it's that very reason. So when we enable rounding, it's like taking a photo. At that point in time, whatever the differences were, they are added and subtracted to whichever account you choose. Making further changes does not change the rounding amount that was added or subtracted to the rounding account. Now, recalculate in this case means that even though the rounding is enabled, it can see that in fact the balance sheet isn't balanced, or that the the income statement doesn't agree to the net inc, or the cash flow is not tying into the cash, even though it's enabled. So that throws it into recalculate. So what do? We just turn the rounding off. We set it out into disabled, which then recalculates the differences. And then once we enable it again, it will then attach the correct, rounding difference to the accounts that were selected. Okay, so what this means is rounding should really be the very last thing you do when you complete the file. And if you do make more changes, make sure you switch your rounding off, make your changes, and then turn it on again. Okay, and you won't hit this problem. Okay, this is a weird one. Selecting a rounding account that appears in multiple places. And the only time I really see this is if somebody has chosen a 999 line. So remember, you can use 999 to disable a line that cannot be deleted. So we can skip a line which cannot be deleted. For example, cash is either cash or bank indebtedness. It's calculated. So it's not a line we can, right click on and delete, but we can always choose a skip or a 999 option. And if that had been the rounding account, potentially it could go to being an unassigned map, and then that would cause us the same problem again, where we end up with the dreaded recalculate. So in other words, don't round to a 999 account and we won't have this problem. Okay, so the last one, this is the one that I would have guessed as well, is that the prior year's retained earnings does not tie into the current year's opening retained earnings balance. So why does this happen? You gave your client adjusting journal entries and they didn't post them, or they posted them to the wrong year or whatever. How do we fix this problem? Well, we can either edit the opening balances directly in the working trial balance, or post transaction entries, which is before this opening balance. So we're actually adjusting from a preliminary balance. Either one would work, but we need these two balances to be the same in order for us to be able to turn on the rounding. This is why we're going to say it again, we keep saying it, is that on your document manager, make sure you have your draft balance sheet by map number and your draft income statement by map number. These have to work before we switch over to the JASIF financial statements. This has to balance the balance sheet, and this ending has to agree to this opening, or we're going to end up with recalculate in the rounding. Okay, so just keep that in mind. If we're doing a not-for-profit, the net assets from the prior year should agree to the opening position of the net assets in the current year. It's the same idea. We don't use retained earnings for not-for-profit, but it's the same concept. The net assets has to agree.